Some stories are worth telling over and over. Some things are worth celebrating again and again. Some rituals and traditions, however old, can still teach us and mould us and make us think. Some symbols are worth cherishing. In Luke chapter 22, Jesus sends two of his disciples ahead of him to prepare the Passover. 2 days in advance to make preparations. So we get a sense of anticipation. There is intention here. There is forethought. This is not a spur-of-the-moment dinner party or a last night out with the boys. This was a really big deal. He sent two of his crew ahead to get it ready. And when Jesus arrives, he says this in verse 15, he says, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you. I've longed for it." And he says this Passover, not just the Passover, because you've never done that before. They've done it before. They've done this Passover thing before. But this Passover, this particular Passover, the table was prepared. The Passover, the annual celebration that God's people had been commemorating since the Exodus. The Passover, the biggest event on the Jewish calendar. The Passover where people travelled from far and wide to come to Jerusalem, to celebrate, to remember, to tell the stories, to make their sacrifices. Been going on for 1400 years maybe. It was a big deal. It had always been a big deal. And why wouldn't it be? Because Passover commemorated like the most incredible event in God's people's history. This was where their identity came from as a holy nation. This was where the Israelites got their understanding of oppression and justice, affliction and freedom. This is where the Israelites learnt who God was, a God whom they had forgotten his name. A people who had been so downtrodden for so long that they had no purpose, no dignity, no worth, but through this event were elevated as a holy nation. Slaves who were set free. A whole nation that didn't fight back, that didn't rise up in revolution and overthrow, but in one night when their lintels were covered with the blood of a lamb, death passed over them and they walked in freedom. And so in all the toing and froing that we follow through the rest of the Old Testament, the chronicle of God's people, we see them in relationship with God, out of relationship with God, in relationship with God, out of relationship with God. And again we see this phrase repeated where God says to them, remember, I am the Lord your God who what? Brought you out of Egypt. At the very first Passover in Exodus 12, at the end of some detailed descriptions about how to prepare the meal, a spotless lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, in verse 14, the Lord instructs them and he says this, "This is a day you are to commemorate for generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." Keep doing it. Again and again. And so they did. And this is how stories were told. This is how faith was passed on. This is how the children learnt. This is how culture is created through feasts and festivals, coming together in community, sharing a meal. Passover was not just for the priests. This wasn't a practice just for the adults. The kids were part of it too. It was for all of God's people. It was highly anticipated, the biggest event of the year. Because some stories are worth telling over and over. Some things are worth celebrating again and again. Some rituals and traditions, however old, make us think and teach us and mould us. Some symbols are worth cherishing. So this Passover thing continues to be a reference point for the Israelites, kind of an indication of where they are at with their relationship with God. Were they remembering? Were they telling the story? Hezekiah becomes king, and after years of chasing foreign gods, he calls the people back into covenant, and he says, we need to celebrate Passover. And so the table is prepared. In 2 Kings, Josiah recognises there's this gaping hole in the spiritual life of the Israelites. He says, we've been missing the Passover, we haven't been telling the story, and the table is prepared. In the book of Ezra, when the temple is rebuilt, they celebrate the Passover together. The table is prepared. And so here in the first century, Jesus reclines with his disciples, and the table is prepared. The table had always been prepared. In fact, Jesus had sat down to this same meal many times before. The disciples had shared this meal many times before. It was familiar. It was tradition. It wasn't new. It was special. But Jesus was about to make it spectacular. It was one of those Jesus moments where he goes, you've heard this, but I'm going to tell you this. You've seen this before, but I'm going to show you this. So they're to eat a prepared lamb. In Exodus 12, it tells us that on the 10th day of the month, they were to take a lamb without defect, a perfect, blameless, spotless lamb. And it says, this is the instruction God gave to the Israelites while they were living in Egypt. Take that lamb and keep it until the 14th day. Set it apart. Don't just identify which one in the flock. Don't just leave it in the pen with the others. Keep it. Kind of like a pet. Maybe some of them even brought it into their home. But it was tended and fed and sheltered and protected. Just this week, the Darby family got a pet. It's the first time ever. It's a budgie. Exactly. A budgerigar, a parakeet for our American friends. I can see Terry there going, a budgie? It's a budgie? Yeah. And let me tell you, we've had that budgie for 4 days. It doesn't take long to get attached to a pet. If I had to after 4 days. God said to them, keep that lamb with you for 4 days and then sacrifice it. Now watch this. Jesus comes into the home of the Jews, into Jerusalem, 4 days before Passover. The triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. Just days before, he comes in and he becomes part of the people. Into the heart of the people. One of them set apart as the spotless lamb, celebrated. Palm Sunday, days later, he's sacrificed at Passover. I wept when I first saw that. The Passover wasn't just about looking backwards, it had always been pointing forward to him, written on every page, the desire of all ages. There's power in those details. Throughout the generations, roughly, like I said, 1,400 years maybe, between the Exodus, the first Passover, and here where Jesus sits with his disciples at the Last Supper. And over time, there had been various rituals, traditions that had been added in to that simple prescription God had given. They had become rabbinic requirements, things that were added to the practice to help tell the story. So the Jews, every year, when they would sit down to a Passover, would follow a Seder. Everybody say Seder. A very Australian Seder. It was like an order, a program of events that would say, this is how the host will tell the story and lead people through. We will take the bread here. We'll recite this psalm here. We will ask these questions here. The Seder included the children. The children of the house would speak up at certain points and say, why is this night more important than any other night? And the host would tell the story. So there's a detailed plan for the telling of the story, which was called the Haggadah. Everybody say that one, Haggadah. Yeah, good, a good Australian Haggadah. So when it would come to the breaking of the bread, the unleavened bread that God had prescribed at the first Passover, over time, traditions came to be added to this, and the host was to take the bread, the matzah, and break it into three. One that was three. And take the middle one out and hide it and cover it in cloth. If there were children in the home, they would actually take it and hide it somewhere in the house and make a game of it. And at some point, the children would have to go and find the bread, the afikomen, and bring it back. But at a certain point during the Seder, the host would take that covered up, that middle piece from the three that had been hidden and covered in cloth, and bring it out. He would bring it back and then break it into small pieces and share it around the table. Wow. One taken from three, buried and brought back. Wow. One broken and shared. So when Jesus takes that piece of bread and shares it, it wasn't a new idea that he went, I know, this is how I'll explain it to the disciples. I'll take some bread and I'll break it. No, they had done this before. It was not new. It was familiar. It was tradition. It was special. But then Jesus does this spectacular thing where he takes that bread and he says, this is my body broken for you. Do you get it, guys? All these years, but let me tell you now, this is my body. Now, the wine was not prescribed in that first Passover, but again, over time, it became a rabbinic requirement to share wine at a feast, right? At the Passover, you get to have 4 cups because it's the biggest event of the year. And at certain points throughout the Seder, the host would lift up the cup, and it was kind of like a toast, a celebration of a promise. It was a celebration of 4 promises that were given to Moses before he even came to Egypt. When God was telling him what he was going to do. In Exodus 6:6-7, God says this to Moses. He's telling what he's going to do. He says, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment, and I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. So now, in the first century, at 4 points throughout the Seder, the glass is filled and raised, and there is essentially a toast to these fulfilled promises, the faithfulness of God. I will bring you. I will deliver you. I will redeem you. And I will take you. Now, we know that Jesus followed a traditional Seder. The gospel writers don't have to say, we followed the Seder. They just have to say, we did Passover. They all knew. It's what everybody did. Now, in Luke's account, Luke the details man, he says that Jesus took the cup after they had eaten and given thanks. We know that according to the Seder, that after the meal and after giving thanks was the 3rd cup. Actually, Matthew and Mark also say that it was after Jesus had given thanks that he raised the cup. When did Jews give thanks in their meal? At the end. They don't say grace before, you say it at the end. So we know it's the end of the meal. Luke says after he had eaten and given thanks, he raises the 3rd cup. According to the Seder, it's the 3rd cup. You know what that 3rd cup is? I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. And this is the cup where Jesus says, this is my blood poured out for you. The Passover had not only pointed back, it was pointing to this. Just as Israel had been brought out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, now Jesus brings us out from the burden of sin. Just as Israel was delivered from slavery to them, Jesus delivers us from slavery to fear, guilt, shame, anything that binds us. Just as Israel was redeemed with an outstretched arm, Jesus redeemed us with outstretched arms. Just as Israel was taken to be his people, Jesus takes us and will take us home. Promises translated, made present and fulfilled in Jesus Christ, a new Exodus. For 1400 years, God's people had been celebrating and remembering an event that changed the world of the Israelites. But here at the Last Supper, Jesus changes the game and we celebrate and remember an event that changed the entire cosmos. So now Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. Because some stories are worth telling over and over. Some things are worth celebrating again and again. Some rituals and traditions teach us and mould us and make us think. And some symbols are worth cherishing. Right now at your tables, the table is prepared. We have bread for you, wine, grape juice for you. Right now, I want you to take that bread. Do that now. Take that bread in your hand. I want you to hold it in your hand. If you require gluten-free bread, we have that for you in the corner, or walking around over here. I want you to take that bread in your hand. We've already shared this text, but let me tell you again that Jesus took the bread and he broke it and he said, take, eat. This is my body broken for you. Jesus, we remember your sacrifice. We thank you for your broken body and this emblem that reminds us. And as we eat it, bless us. As we feed, nourish us, because it is your bread alone that gives us life. Amen. At your tables, you have wine. Take the wine. I want you to hold this up and claim those promises that Jesus fulfilled. The promise to bring you out, to deliver you from whatever binds you, to redeem you and take you as his and take you home. Jesus, we thank you for your blood that was spilled. You said, drink of it, all of you. This is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Thank you. A number of years ago, my husband and I began hosting a Passover of sorts at our house around Easter time. We would invite friends and family and follow a Seder to really experience what it might have been like in that upper room. And the table was laid and we would share verses about Christ the Lamb, Christ the bread of life. We would share a whole meal, break bread, fill our glasses 4 times. Once I even attempted to cook lamb for those who wanted to partake in an authentic experience. I'm a vegetarian. I'd never cooked meat before. I think that dish turned out somewhat akin to a leather boot. The next year we ate mock lamb. But we sang songs together and we handed out tambourines and shakers to all the kids. It was noisy and fun. I remember one year, Gibbo and Christy were there and we shared these 4 cups and we raised our glasses and we went around and we shared testimony of each of these promises and finished the sentences for each of us. He will bring me out of. He will deliver me from. He has redeemed me. He will take me. Now, at the end of a Passover, there's a time of celebration, sharing, singing psalms, specific psalms that are set. But at the very end, Psalm 136 was always shared. We can assume Jesus did this as well. It actually says in Luke that after they had sung the last hymn, they went to Gethsemane. Psalm 136. I want to lead you in a portion of that. If I was Dillis, we'd sing it. But I'm not, so we're going to say it. This is a really repetitive psalm. It's like a call and response. And the beautiful thing about a call and response like this is that it allows us to say it enough till we believe it. To say it enough to let it sink in and to allow ourselves to be completely convinced of it till we can say it with conviction. Now, this is a really long psalm, so we're not going to do the whole thing. But I'm going to read some of this and I want you to respond with His faithful love endures forever. Can you stand while we do this? Can you stand? Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods. His faithful love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords. His faithful love endures forever. To Him who alone does great wonders, His faithful love endures forever. To Him who by understanding made the heavens, to Him who spread out the earth above the waters, to Him who made the great lights, the sun to rule over the day, the moon and the stars to rule over the night, to Him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt and brought Israel out from among them with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. It is He who remembered us in our low estate and rescued us from our foes. Give thanks to the God of heaven.